My name is Miriam Strauss. Welcome to my channel. There's a common stereotype that Jews are good with money. But why does this stereotype exist, and is it based on the truth? Well, this stereotype actually stems from around the time of the Middle Ages throughout Europe. But before we can jump into the Middle Ages, you need to understand a bit about Jewish culture more traditionally in biblical times. The relationship between Jewish religious texts such as the Talmud and the Torah and the development of economic skills in Jewish communities is a complex and multifaceted topic. You see, Judaism was not just intended to be a religion that solely focused on faith and service of God, but it is equally an ethnicity, culture, and a distinct society and way of living. What I mean by that is that Judaism created one of the first ever established societies with a legal justice system and economic rules during a time in the world where there was little to no other established societies. And human beings were much more wild with no rule or order, and much of the world was made up of warring tribes and clans, and each man was kind of out for himself. Written language and literacy was not very common at the time, and during those historical times, Jewish communities, by contrast, placed a high emphasis on literacy and education. The study of the Torah, the central reference of the Jewish religious texts, and the Talmud, which is a central text of rabbinic commentary containing laws, ethics, philosophy, customs, economic discussions, and history, has been integral to Jewish life. This focus on learning often resulted in a higher literacy rate among Jews compared to their non-Jewish neighbors in many historical periods. The ability to read and study complex texts could indirectly contribute to the development of analytical and critical thinking skills, which are valuable in various economic activities. The Jewish legal and ethical frameworks primarily come from the Talmud and the Torah, which provide extensive legal and ethical guidelines covering a wide range of activities, including commerce and finance. These texts discuss concepts which we would now classify as contracts, property rights, loans, interests, and other economic matters in great detail. For example, the Talmud might spend many pages analyzing a fact pattern such as if your cow grazes on a neighbor's land and becomes sick or damages their property, who is liable to whom, for what, and why, and what is the appropriate compensation. These types of teachings that promoted young Jews to grapple with these complex legal and economic analyses provided Jewish individuals with greater exposure to business ethics and practices from a young age. Additionally, due to historical circumstances, including periods of persecution and migration, many Jewish communities had to be adaptable and resourceful. This adaptability could extend to the economic realm, where Jews might have had to engage in various trades and businesses just in order to survive. Their religious and ethical teachings, grounded in texts like the Talmud and Torah, could offer guidance to them in those endeavors. Now, cut to the future. In the Middle Ages in Europe, this was a very complex time for Jewish history, shaped by various social, economic, and religious factors. Due to various empires and colonizing forces in the Middle East, many Jews were expelled from their indigenous land in Israel, or they fled to escape persecution. However, it is important to note, as a side note, that many Jews did remain in the Middle East, either fled to Middle Eastern countries or even stayed in their indigenous homeland and just faced persecution. For the Jews that went to Europe, initially they were concentrated largely in Southern Europe, but during the High and Late Middle Ages, they migrated north, often at the invitation of local Christian rulers who recognized their economic skills and potential to boost the economy. Even during this period of time, Jews tended to have slightly above average economic skills because of their culture and teaching. For example, during the time period, the average person was still completely illiterate, while Jews continued to maintain customs to learn and read and study as part of their religious practice. Therefore, Jews were often more literate as compared to the average non-Jew during the Middle Ages. Literacy in Europe was generally limited only to clergy and some members of the nobility. The majority of the population, particularly the poor and those in rural areas, had little or no access to education. It wasn't until the late Middle Ages that literacy began to spread more broadly among the population, but even by the year 1500, literacy rates among males in England were, for example, only estimated to be about 10 to 25%. The gap in literacy rates can be attributed to the different roles education played in Jewish versus Christian societies. While Jewish culture integrated education and literacy as a central religious tenet, in Christian Europe, literacy was often seen as necessary only for religious or administrative elites. Now, in addition to the higher literacy rates, Jews also continued to hone their analytical and economic skills by continuing to study the various rules, analyses, and principles in the Talmud and the Torah. At the same time, under Christianity, Christians were prohibited from lending money to fellow Christians with interest, which meant that if a Christian person needed a loan, they often had no one to go to because there was no one in the Christian society who was incentivized to give them a loan if they could not charge any interest. This even included kings and emperors who often needed loans to fund wars and other efforts. So various leaders invited Jews to come to their community to serve as money lenders in order to boost the economy, drive up business for the average local businessman, and fund the government's efforts. However, when Jews were invited to these communities, they were not invited to join as equal citizens, but were rather subject to discriminatory laws as second-class citizens. For example, there were often legal restrictions preventing Jews from owning land or prohibiting them from joining local guilds or trades. These prohibitions further pushed Jews into these money lending roles because they had little to no other means to earn a living wage to feed their family. This exclusion was due to both religious attitudes and socioeconomic factors. Local rulers and church officials restricted Jews from many occupations, pushing them into marginal jobs considered socially inferior, such as tax and rent collecting and money lending. The Catholic Church's doctrine at the time regarding money lending with interest, also known as usury, as a sin, which was forbidden to Christians. As Jews were not subject to this religious restriction, they were often selected for the money lending business. This situation led to negative stereotypes and propaganda depicting Jews as greedy and usurious, which were further fueled by the tensions between Jewish creditors and Christian debtors. Jews in medieval Europe were frequently segregated and forced to live in ghettos, isolated areas designated for them, and even to this day, you might travel to certain countries that still refer to those areas as the Jewish quarter. They were denied citizenship rights, barred from government and military posts, and compelled to live under restrictive conditions. This segregation was part of a broader pattern of anti-Semitic policies and attitudes that manifested in various forms, including compulsory wearing of distinctive clothing like the yellow badge. This practice of segregation continued into the 19th and early 20th centuries in many parts of Europe. As a result of this arrangement, where Jews were invited by European leaders to act as moneylenders, they were never wholeheartedly embraced, but rather they were tolerated. That is until they would eventually thrive from their business dealings, and the local non-Jewish European population who were their debtors would then grow to resent them in almost every instance across different European countries. You see, economically, Jews became prominent in trade, banking, and money lending in late medieval Europe. However, their economic success often aroused envy and led to further persecution and expulsion across Europe. Jews often faced economic exploitation and were made scapegoats during times of crisis. For instance, during the Black Death in the mid-14th century, Jews were falsely accused of causing the plague by poisoning wells, leading to massacres and destruction of Jewish communities. Additionally, Jews were perceived as the private property of the king in some regions, making them vulnerable to exploitation by the rulers. For example, in England, Jews' role as moneylender was later used against them as part of the justification for their expulsion when they could no longer lend money to the king. Furthermore, the socioeconomic status and occupation of Jews have been subject to various anti-Semitic stereotypes throughout history, often rooted in jealousy and resentment toward their economic success and alleged control over finances. These factors combine to create a challenging and often perilous environment for Jews in medieval Europe, shaping their social and economic experiences significantly. Now, the cycle often went something like this. Jews would be invited to come to a region where local entrepreneurs, businessmen, kings, and emperors would borrow money from them. Typically, this would create a boost in the local economy, and business would be booming, which would allow those businessmen and leaders to pay back the loans at the agreed upon interest rates. However, as is always inevitable, economies do not stay booming forever, and there is necessarily a point in history where there will be an economic downturn for every society. For example, a businessman who borrowed money eventually got to a situation where he made a bad investment and was unable to repay the loan. Additionally, kings who borrowed money to go to war would eventually lose a war, which meant they didn't make any spoils from the war to repay the loan. And when these economic downturns occurred, the king or emperor who had invited the Jews to his community would instantly turn on those same Jews to avoid having to repay his loans to them. For example, in Vienna, between the years of 1669 and 1670, Jews were expelled from Vienna by Leopold I, who was the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. This expulsion also included a ban on Jewish settlements in the Austrian hereditary lands. The emperor expelled the Jews because he could not repay loans due to his failures at war. Not only did he expel them, but he vilified them and blamed them for his own poor economic and political failures. Additionally, the emperor seized all assets and money owned by the Jews, and they often fled with whatever they could simply carry on their back. More tragically, for the most successful Jewish moneylenders, he ordered their execution, had them killed, and then, of course, stole all of their money and assets. This is just one example of many. This expulsion of Jews from Vienna in the late 17th century was part of a long and complex history of Jewish presence and expulsion in various European regions. Specifically, it's important to note that this was not an isolated event, but part of a broader pattern of expulsions and migrations that affected Jewish communities throughout Europe over centuries. These expulsions were often driven by a mix of economic, religious, and political factors, and they had significant impacts on the Jewish communities of the time. As a result of this trend, governments, kings, emperors were incentivized to spread negative stereotypes and propaganda about Jews in order to justify the king or emperor's heinous acts against those Jews. This is where stereotypes were born about Jews being evil, usurious, or money hungry. Persecution was also fueled by religious factors. In Christian Europe, for example, Jews were often falsely accused of the killing of Jesus, despite the fact that it was the Romans who killed Jesus. This also led to widespread hatred and violence. But it is ironic that the Jews were restricted to marginal occupations and couldn't do much more than money lending by law, but they were often the only group able to engage in money lending due to Christian prohibitions against usury, but then they were frequently stereotyped as greedy and usurious when society wanted to blame them for something or find fault with them to suit certain political narratives. This period also saw increased persecution, particularly in the context of the Christian Crusades, during which time Jewish communities were destroyed and there were frequent massacres, expulsions, and deportations. For example, Jews were expelled from England in the year 1290, from France in the year 1394, and from Spain in 1492, just to name a few of the dozens upon dozens of times that Jews were repeatedly killed, exiled, and deported in Europe well before World War II or the Holocaust ever even happened. In some European countries, there were even cycles where several decades after they had initially killed and expelled the Jews, they then later re-invited Jews back to their community once again to try to boost their economy once more and solve their money lending and economic issues all over again. Jews often had very little opportunity and were persecuted in most areas where they found themselves. So when they were invited back to these places, they often did not feel like they had a better choice than to try their luck and go back and try to build a life and livelihood in those same cities that had previously killed and persecuted their ancestors. So the cycle often repeated itself. For example, again in Vienna during the reign of Emperor Joseph II in the late 1700s, the Jews were invited back and began to slowly gain some basic rights, leading to a gradual reestablishment of the Jewish community in Vienna. But there were still restrictions, of course, placed on what type of work they could partake in, and they were still not treated entirely equal to ordinary citizens. So they were still incentivized to become moneylenders. By the 19th century, the Jewish population of Vienna had grown quite a bit, but as I'm sure you know, the Holocaust came soon after that, which was a whole different level of persecution of the Jews all throughout Europe. Under Christian rulers throughout Europe, Jewish residents often depended on charters issued by rulers, which could be revoked at any time and under which the Jews faced arbitrary policy applications and punishments. Overall, the Jews in medieval Europe faced paradoxical situations. They were needed for their economic roles, but were also resented and persecuted for them, often scapegoated for broader societal issues. This history of persecution and forced adaptation to limited economic roles played a significant role in shaping the Jewish experience in Europe during the Middle Ages. So what does all of this mean? Are Jews in fact good with money, and do all Jews have money? Well, the answer is that there have been many times in history where we were forced to be good with money to secure our own survival. But then there were just as many times in history where all of our money and hard work was stolen from us. For example, my grandparents fled from Nazi Germany and Poland with a few dollars in their pocket, and I grew up dirt poor in an inner city neighborhood of New York City just north of Harlem. So not all Jews are rich, and in fact many Jews come from poverty and are doing their best to rebuild a life for their children from scratch. So when you consider and talk about Jewish people in relation to money, Just remember that it wasn't until after the Holocaust, only about 75 years ago, that many Jews in the world could even work in other trades besides money lending. And also remember that even when we did manage to gain success in money lending or whatever other limited role we were able to work in, that success and any money we earned was in almost all cases eventually stolen from us. So you should be careful not to falsely believe that all Jews have money and power, because it is a frankly false, gross oversimplification of the reality that many Jews have experienced. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to subscribe to my channel down below. Please also watch this next video over here, which YouTube thinks you're really going to enjoy. Thank you guys all so much for watching.